Hello everyone and welcome to this first session of the ninth week of Angular development course. In this week, we are going to focus predominantly on what is template-driven forms. So in the previous week, we learned how pipes helps us to transform data that are passed from template expression and HTML. We also learned how pipes are executed on a pure change to the input, which are called as pure pipes, and pipes which get executed for all Angular change detection cycle are called as impure pipes. We also saw what are template-driven and reactive forms and when to use what. So in the current week, the following are the key topics which we are going to cover. The first is creating a basic template driven form. We will also look into the concepts of what are the things that goes behind a template driven form. Then we will see how can we access the form state. Then we will see how can we validate any forms, how can we use the built-in form validators and also write our own custom validations. We will then look into how to handle the errors in the forms. We will see how can we set the values programmatically in the forms. We will then see how can we group the controls in a form, and finally we will see how can we submit or reset any form. So the learning objective of this week is we will be learning the basics of creating a template driven form and the terminologies used in that. We will see how to access the form status. We will see how to perform form validation and also error handling in form. We will see how can we set the form values programmatically and group the form controls logically in a form. And finally, we'll see how can we perform submit or reset action in any form. So before going any further, let's first get into the basics of creating a template driven form. So to create a template driven form, we import this module called as form modules to our root or shared module. And in the component, we need to import the ng form class from @Angular forms. So these are the basics. If you need to create a template driven form, first we need to import the forms module into either a root module or the shared module wherever you're creating that particular form. And in the component where you are actually going to create this form, you need to import the ng form class from @Angular forms. And then we define the form controls and set up the form. And before going any further, now let's get to see a demo of this before we proceed with the code. So we'll go to the whiteboard right now. Okay, so before we get any further into defining what is a template driven form, how do we write the code of template driven form, it is very important that we understand the basics of what is forms and what is template driven forms and what are the code terminologies used in that. So as we discussed in the last week, if you remember, a form is nothing but it's just you can say a data entry page for the user where they can provide some input. If you require, you can optionally transform it, or you can validate that particular data that you have. And finally, you can submit this data to your server, right? So this is what a core function of any form is. So it will take the input from the user. Optionally, if you want, you can transform or validate that particular input, and later you submit it to the server for further processing. Right. So based on the domain and based on the business that you work on, these forms may vary a lot. So say for example, if you go to a site like income tax, you would see that the forms are predominantly organized in a page by page or a section by section format, where initially you will see that one form has a basic detail where it pre-populates certain fields for you. Then it will have some optional fields which you can add. Then it will have some mandatory fields which you need to fill, and later it will have a few sections like section 80C, 80D, your income, your deduction, and all that thing. And you will notice that a few of the form you have to type some value, a few of the form you have to, a few of the field you have to select a number, a few of the form you have to kind of select some radio buttons like yes, no, whatever, and a few of the form you will have something like a checkbox, so on and so forth. So the whole point that we're trying to say is a form is nothing but just a input or a bunch of all this input working together in order to achieve a particular business outcome. So similarly, if you go to something like IRCTC, you'll see that it has a form which gives you an option to select a from station or to station, the date, the class of the train you want to book, and how many tickets you want to book, and if you need any special quota like Tatkal, ladies, or any of those things. So this is nothing but a typical form which is used by any travel website. And similarly, if you go for maybe Book My Show or any of those ticketing platform where you can book any movie shows or something, or even for that matter your flight check-in form, you would see that they have a different kind of form wherein first you enter your name and you select the date which you want the show, the time of the show, the number of seats, and if you want to select the seat which you want to get in, then you get a map of the seat and you can select which seat you want. So whether you want the center seat or the front seat or the back seat, whatever you want. And similarly for a bus ticketing application as well. So in all these cases, you will notice that what the user is essentially doing is they are just giving a bunch of input to the application, and the application then optionally converts it or validates it if it meets whatever is the requirement. And if everything is well, it will set it to the backend server for further processing and give the output back to the user in terms of some confirmation or a transaction ID or whatever it is. And also we saw in the previous week that in order to create this form in Angular, you basically have two methods. So Angular basically gives us two ways to define a form, right? So one we saw is a template driven form. I'm just writing TDF in short. And the second one is called as a model driven form or reactive form, right? So what is a template driven form we saw is that in this, the form creation, the form validation, everything is driven from the HTML or your template itself. So that is why it is called as a template driven form. And we saw it is quite simple to implement, but the major disadvantage of that is it is not scalable. And if you need to write some complex logic and you want to do unit testing and all, for that template driven forms are not really the best option. Similarly, for model driven forms or reactive forms, we saw that the core logic of this is driven from your model or your TypeScript file is what we saw. And we saw that it is a bit complex initially to set it up, but over the time it becomes easy to maintain. And the key thing over here is, the key advantage of that is it is more scalable and it is more unit testable, right? So here both of this, what were the disadvantage are the more are the advantages of here, right? So reactive form, we said that since your component is composed of what, a model, and it is like the model is attached to a template. So this is nothing but your HTML and your model is nothing but your TypeScript file, right? So your template driven form is predominantly defined in the HTML itself, where all the core logic is present in HTML. Optionally you can have a few things which are driven from your TypeScript, but the core of the thing will come from your HTML. Whereas in case of your reactive form, your form and all the core logic are defined in your component, and that is what will be driving your entire form logic. So that is what we saw in the last week, right? And now before we jump any further, there are a few basic key form related terminologies which we must all understand before going further. So we must now understand, if you take a form, what are the building blocks of any Angular form. So if you take a particular form, right, so a form is nothing but, as I said earlier, it is a bunch of controls or a bunch of inputs, right? So in Angular terminologies, we have a few technical terms or jargons to define this, okay? So the first is, your entire form is called a form. A form is nothing but it is just a group of controls, or maybe I could say a group of inputs working together is nothing but the form. And in that, each of this input, right, that you see, an input can be any input, right? It could be a text input, it could be a number input, it could be a radio, it could be a checkbox, it could be a toggle button, it could be a date selector. You can have a bunch of different inputs. It doesn't matter what is the input. Even if you can define your own input, a seat selector is as in a bus or a movie ticket application, even that is considered as an input. So each of this input in Angular terms is called as a form control. Okay, what is form control? What is the further thing? We'll see. But for now, understand that any input in your application, like a particular input, say for example, so I'll just define a very simple form. So assume that, I have a form which asks for user ID, it asks for password, okay, and it has two buttons. One is say submit and one is say reset. Okay, so assume this is my simple the login form that I have. So in this case, this user ID, this password, this submit and reset buttons, all of these together constitute my form, right? All of this make my form for login. And in that, each of these individual fields, like the user ID, the password, the submit, the reset, so each of these particular input, one particular input, is called as a form control. Okay, so what is a form control? Essentially is one single element or one single input which is defined in your particular form. Okay, and whatever terminologies I'm telling, it applies to both your template driven form and reactive form. Okay, so the terms are same. The only way we implement is what it will vary. Okay, so if I give you any form, be it IRCTC, be it Make My Trip, it could be even the application that you build. So the number of inputs that you see in your form, that many number of form controls you have. So you can say the other word for form control input is form control. Okay, so form control is nothing but that is what will be actually taking the input from the user, and you'll be doing all your validation and anything on this form control. Okay, the second concept which we should know is called as form group. So what is a form group? Let's try to understand. So if you take a typical form, right, like say even this login, or like maybe you go like book a ticket or whatever, you see that most of these fields are standalone. Say for example, if I take user ID and if I take password, and maybe if I take optionally, maybe like I also take OTP, just for example, you see that all of these fields are kind of independent of each other. They are not kind of dependent on each other, like they logically don't have any connection. So in this case we don't really need to group them. Like each of these can be individual form controls which can just be present in the application. But let's take another example. So say now, like for example, I'm having a form like say user profile. Okay, I'm creating a user profile form wherein say for example, these are my form controls or my inputs. So the first is first name, then maybe I have middle name, then I have my last name, then maybe I have my date of birth, then maybe I have my like present address, then I have my city, then maybe my country, my pin, and I could have my phone, I could have my email, maybe I could have my LinkedIn profile ID, or like a bunch of these kind of things. Okay, in this if you just have a look, like say assume like this is the form I create. So as we saw just now, each of these input that you create are nothing but your form controls, right? Because as I said, a form control is an individual input which you take from a user. So each of these fields that you see is nothing but a form control. But if you just look carefully, a few of these fields are logically related. Say for example, if you take the first three fields, I have my first name, middle name, and last name. So technically, all of these are nothing but parts of the same name, right? Though like user is entering different fields, but logically you can group them into something called as a name, because a name is nothing but a collection of first name, middle name, and last name, right? And similarly, if you take my address, so maybe like though the user enters the address over here, city over here, country over here, pin over here, this entire bunch of thing is nothing but collectively my address, right? And similarly, if I take my phone, email, and LinkedIn ID or whatever, I could collectively maybe like logically group it into something called as contact detail. I'm just making up the names, but I hope you understand. So what I'm trying to say is, in your form, there will be cases where you want to logically group something, or maybe I'll give you a better option. So say for example, like if I want to kind of like book a IRCTC ticket, okay. So if you take a example of IRCTC and Make My Trip or any of those website, so there are a few things which you'll see. So one is like the from station or the from airport where you start. The other would be the to airport or the to station where you start, right? So logically, I could group both of these together, and I can say like maybe like I could just logically give it a name of source destination, right? And similarly, I would have like maybe fields which would take in the passenger information, say something like name, age, your ID, and a bunch of other things like maybe like if you are a frequent flyer, what is your ID of that, so on and so forth. So this I could logically group it as passenger info, right? And similarly, I could also have a bunch of detail like address, because as I just showed you, an address can be split into address, street 1, street 2, country, city, pin code, and all that thing. So all that thing together, I could just put it as address. And similarly, like if I go to payment website, like the payment gateway, you'd see that first I take in the credit card number, then I take the expiry number, the expiry date and month, the month and year, then I take the CVV number. Together I could just put it as credit card detail, so on and so forth, right? So in all this you would see that logically, though we have different inputs, but logically they could be all grouped into some logical data, right? So in order for us to do this logical grouping, now you may have a doubt like what is the use of this logical grouping. Let me explain. So simply let's take an example of address, okay? So assume like in I have like a section in my form which just takes the following things. So I just give address line 1, then I have address line 2, address line 3, I have my city, I have my country, I have my pin. So assume like these are the things in my address which I need to have. So if I'm going to like let the user enter this, right, and just do the thing. So one advantage of logically grouping all of this into one particular group or like one composite unit is, so in future, say like I want to validate something over here. So say for example, if I want to ensure that if the user types maybe or selects or types whatever depending on your form, say assume they type over here Delhi or like Mumbai, Chennai, whatever it may be. So if they select Delhi over here, so automatically I want India to populate over here. And if India is populating over here, I want to have a validation which says, okay, if they are selecting Delhi, the pin code should be somewhere between 11000 to maybe whatever is the maximum number. So let's assume that this is the maximum pin code of Delhi which is possible. So if I want to do these kind of validation, it will be easier for me to logically have it inside this address form group rather than doing it as an individual entity. And similarly, like let's also assume another scenario. So if I give a user two options, one, they can enter their present address, and similarly they can also enter their permanent address. Okay, so if I have a something of a grouping for address, it is easy for me to kind of like manipulate, like bring that template again and manipulate the data of it. If I want to validate something, I can do it. If I want to reset it, so all these things becomes quite easy for me if I logically group all this into a particular group or a bucket. So this in order to achieve this, we have something, a logic called in Angular called as form group. Okay, so what is a form group is, as we just saw, it is nothing but a collection of form group control which are just logically kind of grouped together in order depending on the data they represent. So if you have a bunch of data that has address, so you can group that form group as address. So if you have a bunch of data which kind of tells you a bit about your user, maybe you can name that form group as user info. Okay, so that is the logic of having form group. There is also two other concepts which you need to know right now, but we will be seeing it more on it in the future in the reactive part, but just try to understand it. Okay, so I'll give you a classic example. Say if you have ordered your food or pizza or any of those things online. So if you see over there is an option for you to add more, right? So say for example, or maybe if you take the same IRCTC example. So say assume you have a passenger info, right, where you want to enter the number of passengers. So by default you see you have one row where you enter the name of the passenger, you enter the age of passenger, and maybe you enter the ID type of the passenger, right? What if you want to add more passengers? There will be something called a plus button, or you can give add, and dynamically you will see that another set of row gets added for you where you can type the value. And similarly you can also have a minus button if say you added extra passenger you want to remove, maybe you can remove that as well. And similarly in your pizza, right, if say you want to add the toppings on your pizza, so you can do that, right? You have something like a plus topping, you click on that, it will give you a list what are the toppings you want to add. And in case you added a bunch of toppings and you want to remove it, you could also do that. So if you have say added a bunch of toppings and you press minus like against that name, that particular topping will get removed from the screen. So these are the various things which are dynamic in nature if you observe. So here we don't have the visibility of or I could say the idea when the user will press what. So in these kind of scenarios where you want to dynamically kind of add a bunch of controls to your screen or remove a bunch of control to your screen or validate it and do those kind of work, so this is where we use the concept of form array. Okay, so logically they are also similar to form group. It is not very different. The only difference between a form group and a form control is in a form array, your form actually would be the controls would actually be present as an array. Instead a form group, it is actually nothing but it will be present as a object or as a configuration. But in case of your form array, it will be nothing but it will be present as an array. Okay, so what is the advantage of this is, so say if I had 10 topics, each of my 10 topics would be present as an array. So I know what is in my first index, what is in my second index, what is in my third index, so on and so forth. But one very important thing to remember is, if you want to implement form array, that is not possible, or I would say that is very complex using template driven form. Okay, so for that is why we have the concept of model driven form or reactive form. So we will be looking into the concept of form array in depth when we get into reactive form in the next week. But for now, just remember this concept of form array. So if you want to dynamically add a few controls in your form on the go, so that is where your form array comes into picture. Okay, so with that, I hope you guys are now understood what are the basics of the building blocks of Angular forms and how can we do it. And one other thing which I want to say before we wrap up the session is, if you want to develop template driven form, you have to import something called as the forms module in your Angular application or in your Angular your module that you implement. And in case you are implementing model driven form or reactive form, you have to import the reactive form module in your application. So both of these uses different modules to implement them. And as I said, if you are using the forms module or the template driven forms, you would be predominantly writing all your code in HTML. And if you're using model driven form, predominantly you'll be writing all your code in the TypeScript. Okay, but the concept remains the same. What you will be doing ultimately is, so let's assume, like, we are going to just understand the blueprint of what we will do. So ultimately, be it template driven form or reactive form, what you will do is, you will basically define a form, then you will define what are the form controls in it. Then if you would define what is the, maybe, like, the initial data, or, like, if you want to set some data, all those kind of things. Then if there are any validations which you need to do, you would define that. And finally, if everything is good and the user clicks on submit, you would allow them to submit. And if you want to give them an option to reset and all that stuff, you can do that. So on a high level, this is what you will do, be it a template driven form or a model driven form or a reactive form. So these are the high level steps which you will be doing. So how we do it is what differs between a template driven form and a reactive form, which you'll be seeing in the due course of time. So with that said, I hope now we have a solid understanding of what is forms, what are the few key terminologies of forms. And with that, now we will start with the actual creation of a template driven form in the next session. We are come to the end of this first session, and I'm looking forward to see you in the second session. Thank you.